Linguistics isn't my major. I did pretty well in high school English, and I had a brief creative writing stint, and that's about it. But it's a field that's always kept my attention. My primary interest is in voiceover, which is about communicating with others, and linguistics is about how we communicate with others. You can't really have the former without the latter. But I don't think many people recognize how tightly linguistics, more specifically language, and voiceover are intertwined. It's something that's immediately obvious the second you start thinking about it. I mean, what would voice actors be doing if they weren't even saying words? But it goes deeper than that. It plays into the subs versus dubs discussion, sure, but that's only the tip of the consumer side iceberg. Localization is the process of translating a work and then making adjustments for whichever region you're translating it for. It's one of the largest considerations that translators have to take into account. Machine translation almost always results in a final product that sounds weird at best or consistently inaccurate at worst. And different parts of the world have differing words, terminology, values, cultures, and mutual understandings of when language is being played with, like slang or innuendo. There's always something that's going to be lost when you do a direct translation. This is easiest to see in something like a poem or a song. Words that rhyme with one another in one language usually don't do the same in another. This leaves two options. One, the translator can directly translate the words as is, losing the rhyming aspect and thus the music contained within the passage. Or two, the translator can swap out some of the words or phrases for new ones that rhyme in the new language, which loses the original meaning of the passage by adding in or removing words that the author hadn't intended. Which of the two options you decide to go for depends on who you are, what you believe in, and in the case of the video game industry, what the boss of your studio tells you to do. It's a contentious argument from the angle of the consumer, and fan bases have been broken and divided countless times over from arguments about how a work ought to be translated. But it's something that weighs heavily on the creators and studios behind these works as well. Say, for example, you want to make a game in English. All of the on-screen text is in English, all of the music is sung in English, and all of the voice acting is done entirely in English. Your game does well, and it starts getting shipped to other countries. These countries don't understand English, so it's up to you to translate it. You have to change all of the English text. You might have to hire new singers to re-record songs in the new language. You need to hire new actors who can speak this new language and give a convincing performance. And you have to do this for every single new language. And with roughly 6,500 languages being spoken in the world right now, the price starts adding up fast. Translating text is fairly cheap, and hey, maybe you can get away with not translating some of the music. But having the voice acting in the correct language usually tends to be pretty important, and thus pretty expensive. If you want your game, or book, or movie to succeed anywhere outside of its home country, you have to be ready to conquer the language barrier. For major studios with $100 million budgets, the problem goes away just by throwing money at it until you've translated and localized your work for every market there is. But for smaller studios, or even independent creators, money is one of the first resources to run out. So, if you want to break the language barrier, you have to get creative. If translating your work for everybody is so expensive, why not use a language that nobody understands? Why not use a language that you made up? Ico is one of the most influential games to be created during the PlayStation 2 era, and it released pretty early on into the console's lifetime. Hitting shelves in September of 2001, critics and audiences alike fell in love with the graphics, the design of the world, and most notably, the characters. Lead designer Fumito Ueda set out to create a game modeled after what he called the holding hands approach. After being inspired by works like Galaxy Express 3.9, Ueda wanted his game to showcase characters forming a strong bond with one another without using traditional forms of communication. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Ico starts off with the titular protagonist being dragged away by some knights and thrown into a coffin to be sacrificed. He manages to escape and starts roaming through the castle he's trapped in search of a way out. It's only a single introductory puzzle room before we're introduced to Yorda, the second protagonist of the game, and it's clear from the outset that something about her is different. She's dangling from the ceiling in a cage, she's practically glowing white, and she speaks in, wingdings. This is where the game really starts leaning into the stranger in a strange land formula, but in a way that focuses specifically on language. Neither Ico nor Yorda speak real languages. Both of them were made up for the game, but they serve as 2 degrees of separation between what the player hears and what the player understands. Ico, and later the Queen, share a common language with one another. While it's borderline impossible to translate just from hearing it, the game provides subtitles based on whatever version of the game you're playing, English in my case. But Yorda's language isn't subtitled, because the entire point of the game is that Ico is not able to easily communicate with her. And this is where, from a voice acting perspective, things start to get interesting. Ico's language, which I'll refer to from here on out as common, is hard to pin down the roots of. A few people I've seen have said it's a mashup of English, Japanese, and Latin traits, and that sounds about right to me. The important thing to note is that it's effectively untranslatable without the help of the subtitles, with the ironic twist being that Yorda's language is actually pretty simple by comparison. Each of these characters in her subtitles represent a letter, and those letters can be used to construct words in Romaji, which is just writing out Japanese words using the Latin alphabet. If you then reverse the words and add in a few vowels, you'll be able to get the original Japanese words, which you can then translate to whichever real-world language you want. And this is what creates a really unique vocal effect. Yorda is essentially speaking backwards Japanese, but not in the way that you'll tend to see in a lot of media. Usually, when you think of backwards speech, you're actually thinking of reversed speech. Your satanic panic, secret messages encoded into the heavy metal album sort of thing. It's become culturally ingrained into a lot of people, and many audience members can pick out certain sounds as being reversed speech, even if they can't tell what specifically is being said. For example, this is a reversed sentence, and but with the way that Yorda's sentences are constructed, she speaks backwards. She says the last syllable of her sentence first, and vice versa. For an example of that, this is a backwards sentence, and with a reversed sentence, it's pretty much just always going to sound like nothing more than an audio clip that someone fed through a computer. But with a backwards sentence, it starts to sound like a real language. But none of that would matter if not for the voice acting. Kazuhiro Shindo, Raiko Takahashi, and Misa Watanabe provide the voices for Ico, Yorda, and the Queen respectively, and they had to turn a fake language from written text to spoken word while still acting out all of the necessary emotions and flow to make it sound convincing. This part is a little harder to parse, but we need to understand that both Common and Yorda's language don't exist in real life. The closest lines we can draw are between Japanese and Yorda's language, but the latter is so heavily chopped and swapped around that it's nearly impossible to intuitively translate it by ear. Someone who's fluent in Japanese might be able to recognize some similar elements between the two, but Figuring out what Yorda's saying without the cipher is kind of a waste of time. By the time you figure out one sentence, she'll have said 8 more. And that goes double for Eiko and the Queen, whose language is still untranslatable. These 2 languages were created entirely from scratch for the game, and nobody had ever spoken a word of it until the scripts were put down in front of the voice actors. There was likely some oversight from the creative team, but it's important to note that Team Eiko at this point consisted of only 9 core members, and half of them were artists. The entire design philosophy behind Eiko revolved around stripping down the development process to its absolute bare essentials, which was a move that Ueda later described as being a little extreme. But it means that whatever little oversight there could have been was only a drop in the bucket for what the voice actors had to work with. Remember, this was a game intended to shirk tradition, not embrace it. And what better way to carve out a niche for yourself than by figuring out how a brand new language should sound? Every language has its own rules, usually derived from hundreds of years' worth of verbal communication. Word orders, tenses, and even gendered terminology all stem from what people use them for in a conversation, and these can evolve and change over time. Eiko's use of both Common and Yorda's language necessitated that the voice actors find their own stresses and timings in order to add centuries of history to a set of languages that hadn't even existed the day before. If all of this sounds a little editorialized and pretentious, well, you wouldn't be entirely wrong. But Eiko is an art game, and unashamedly so. Just as there's meaning and intent behind every piece of scenery and every note in the musical score, the voice acting tells the story of the world through a broken form of communication that the audience could never understand on their own. It's strange and ethereal like everything else in the world of Eiko, and it works perfectly well as an artistic language. Never once will a player go through the game and think to themselves that any of the characters aren't speaking a real language. It's exactly as convincing as it needs to be, and the emotions and timings of every line carry just as much weight as if they were spoken in English, Japanese, or Esperanto. It's thematically appropriate, playing into the idea of learning to bond with someone without being able to have a normal conversation with them. Both Common and Yorda's language are central to the final product, but the voice acting is what makes it come alive. All of these essentially nonsense symbols and ciphers don't mean anything until the voice actors impart meaning onto them, and it turns what's little more than a jumbled series of letters into cries for help or defiant counters. And what's more, it saves money. Having the characters in the game speak only in their respective fake languages means that there's almost nothing that needs to be translated for foreign audiences outside of the subtitles, and it's difficult to lose meaning from the original as well. After all, the original doesn't carry any inherent meaning because it's not a real language. Translators are free to add and take away as much as they feel is appropriate purely because there isn't anything to be lost. Localization could never hurt a game like Eiko. It could only help it. With Team Eiko being so small at the time, they would be able to easily and cheaply get their game into as many markets as they wanted, simply because the only thing that needed to be changed were a couple of text strings. The story of Eiko is universal, as is the way that it's told. In linguistics, there's a pair of terms that are used to describe constructed languages, or conlangs like the ones found in Eiko. These are known as a priori and a posteriori, and they're used to describe how closely a made-up language relates to organic, real-world languages. A priori means that the conlang stands on its own as not really being influenced by anything, while a posteriori conlangs are based on another language. Which of these applies to any given conlang is a debate that's been raging for centuries, but Eco's relations to real-world languages are fairly obvious. Yorda's language is effectively just backwards Japanese, after all, with all of the grammar and construction rules that come with that. But this is where the debate starts. Virtually all conlangs were invented by someone whose mother tongue is a real organic language. So how can anyone be certain that a conlang wasn't influenced by something in the real world, even subconsciously? How can you say that anything is actually a priori? Well, let's go one step further. Let's make a language that isn't a language at all. I have a confession to make. At the time of writing, I've never played The Sims. Any of them. It's a franchise that's completely passed me by, from the very first entries back in 2000 all the way up to today. Which is weird, right? It seems like everyone's collectively agreed that The Sims has universal appeal. Heck, The Sims 3 is a game that people who say that they don't play video games have played. But I know that there's something really important that I wanted to talk about in this video, and that's in The Sims and nowhere else, so I bought The Sims 4. Yeah, the new one that nobody likes. The things I do for you people. The Sims was a game spearheaded by famous game designer Will Wright at the turn of the millennium. Hot off the heels of SimCity, and with Maxis starting to make a name for itself, Will Wright turned to the idea of making a life simulator. Deemed an interactive dollhouse by investors, many were skeptical if the game would be profitable. But Will, spurred by the loss of his own home in the 1991 Oakland firestorm, continued to push forward with the idea. This wasn't just going to be about architecture like SimCity was. This was going to be a full-blown storytelling game, where every player would be able to walk away with their own tales to share. Ironically enough, the story of The Sims was that it had no story. The players were in charge of creating as much meaning for their characters as they wanted to. And this is where the major difference between The Sims and Eco reveals itself. See, the languages of Eco are core to its storytelling. You can't tell the story of Eco without also creating and presenting its languages. The same thing is true of The Sims. But Eco uses its languages as a means to further the story that it has in order to tell that story to the player. The Sims uses its own language to cover up the fact that there is no story and allows the player to tell whatever story they please. And that language is Simlish. Simlish, though technically invented for Simcopter back in 1996, didn't really hit its stride until it showed up in The Sims. Will Wright wanted Sims to be able to communicate amongst themselves while also telling a story to the player. To facilitate this, he decided that conversations needed to be as much of a blank slate as possible, and that meant divorcing Simlish as much as possible from real-world languages. Some initial attempts were made. First, they tried instruments, and then they tried sight readings of Ukrainian and Navajo, neither of which really worked. Eventually, Stephen Kieran, the improv actor that Maxis had brought on to provide the voice of the male Sims, asked if he could try something different. He started speaking in impassioned, total gibberish. See, Simlish was originally a language that was a posteriori. It was planned to just be a reading of some languages that were alien to most English speakers, with all of the pronunciations done wrong to throw off anyone who actually spoke them. It was Stephen Kieran who completely flipped the concept on its head and started pulling nonsense out of thin air in different tones and inflections. The exact same line could be said in a multitude of different moods, suited to fit whatever the sim in question was feeling at the time. Simlish, by virtue of no longer having a basis in anything, became a priori. Nothing meant anything, which allowed for both the actors and the players to attribute whatever meaning they wanted to the random sounds that their Sims made. Simlish became a language that isn't even a language at all. It's how you can interpret this as a legitimate conversation. You're given some very light context in the form of a word or two describing what your Sims are talking about, but everything apart from that is nothing more than the results of a random number generator. The little pictures that show up in their speech bubbles, the direction a conversation takes, and even the phrases being used are completely randomized. The best that you can hope for beyond that is a single word at the top that tells you if the conversation is going well or not. Beyond that, you have to rely entirely on the voice acting. Not what's being said, but how. Strip away all of the on-screen elements, and you can still tell what's going on. Sims, and by extension their actors, are incredibly expressive in everything that they say. It's exaggerated and cartoony, sure, but that's the point. If it wasn't over the top, you wouldn't be able to figure out how a Sim was feeling from the tone of their voice alone. The actors for The Sims, from what I know, are given even less context than the actors for Eco. Since none of these words actually mean anything, all of their directions are just based on mood and a short clip that they see of the Sim acting out whatever it is that they're feeling on the screen. That would be things like joking around, speaking with confidence, sounding depressed, that sort of thing. The direction that the actors are given is basically nothing more than the context blurbs that the player sees in-game. This creates an environment that allows players to tell their own stories. There are far too many factors that need to be considered during the first few hours of an average playthrough to justify creating unique lines for all of them. Allow me to give you an example. This is my Sim. There are many like it, but this one is mine. Sims come with a variety of traits and ambitions that you can choose from, and all of these will influence the stories that you can tell yourself using your Sim as a blank canvas. You can be a goofball, you can be a computer nerd, or, if you're like me, you can be a homewrecker. My Sim moved into town, and after spending 3 straight days playing Tetris on his $4,000 Razer gaming rig, decided he needed to start dating someone. Eventually, he set his sights on a Miss Bella Goth, just one town over. Only one problem. Bella was married. Keyword: was. After a successful wooing, and then woohooing, my Sim asked her to move in. Once the documents were signed, all he had left to do was drain the entire Goth family coffers dry, and then force Bella's kids from the last marriage to live with her ex-husband in a 3-story house that he, most certainly, could no longer afford. After that, we had a baby girl named Peter. Now, a question for you. If we were trying to use a real language through this entire process, how would the devs create that many unique lines of dialogue for a single branch of a story that wouldn't be seen by anyone who's not a complete sociopath? Short answer, they wouldn't. Slightly longer answer, it would probably cost a few thousand in booth fees for something that only took me 2 real-life hours to play through. Instead, by keeping the lines in gibberish, I could project whatever I wanted into the conversations that all of the Sims of this story were involved in, and every tonal shift or joke or confession of forbidden love was made clear almost exclusively due to the acting. This, really, is the beauty of The Sims. Simlish is universal. Show the exact same scene to 10 different players from 10 different cultures, and they'll all come away from it to tell you 10 different stories. And keeping things universal is a good thing, both from a creative standpoint and the business aspect. The Sims is a big franchise. It's estimated to have sold about 200 million copies across the globe, and there are a ton of regions that most certainly would have been otherwise overlooked that got their hands on a localized copy purely because the voice actors never needed to be replaced. Compared to Eco, there's a lot more text that needs to be translated, and that's the biggest factor in getting these games to as many audiences as possible. Eco is a game that you could probably beat in a couple of hours. A game of The Sims could conceivably last forever. But having a lot of text isn't a problem if you're a massive company like EA. Team Eco only had 9 people working on the game. EA has thousands. And it's a lot easier to change some on-screen text to another language than it is to license new actors for the region, rewrite their lines, record them, master them, get them all programmed into the game in place of the original lines, do additional bug testing to see if everything is working correctly, ship it out to your region of choice, and then repeat that process for every single language that you're hoping to sell it to. Having the amount of unique real-language voice lines that you would need to make this work would be borderline impossible to do just for the English release of the game. Doing it for dozens of other languages on top of that is unthinkable. Like we've said before, any translation or localization is always going to lose something in the process, and that means that the context of certain scenes will vary depending on what version of the game you're playing. For example, one of the traits in the English version of The Sims 4 is called bro. It's basically like being a frat boy. Beer, football, physical violence, that sort of thing. The French version is a little different. Instead of bro, it's membre d'un groupe de potes. Not quite as snappy as the original. But barring an outright mistranslation, localization can never take anything away from The Sims. Player agency is prioritized above all else, and it's up to the players to hand-wave away any gaps in their own stories. Any translation missteps or cultural oversights can just as easily be excused by the fact that Sims live in their own little world with their own weird language. There's enough of a gap present between The Sims and reality that anything that can't make it through the culture divide probably won't even be noticed by most players. Simlish, in a way, has resulted in the creation of a culture that everyone can be a part of. As time has gone on, Simlish has become more and more popular. Artists and bands such as Katy Perry, Paramore, and My Chemical Romance have all recorded songs entirely in Simlish for these games, in order to invoke a sense of distant familiarity within players. This is reflective of Simlish as a whole, really. It doesn't sound like anything, but all of the beats and feelings are still there. Just so long as you can pin down the emotions, you can make gibberish come to life. The Sims as a franchise has outgrown its roots, but the contributions to Simlish by the original actors continue to influence it to this day. Stephen Kieran and Jerry Lawler provided the voices for the male and female Sims back in 2000, but neither of them are involved with the franchise any longer. The mantle has been taken up by dozens of different actors throughout the years, and all of them are responsible for continuing to make Simlish feel like an organic, storied language. Whether they're new to the scene, industry veterans, or even celebrity cameos, everyone who's provided a voice for a Sim has helped to make the world feel alive. While doing research for this video, I came across a book called From Elvish to Klingon: Exploring Invented Languages. It's been put together by a variety of different writers, and features writing by James Portnow, who you probably know from Extra Credits fame. Chapter 6, Gaming Language and Language Games, is written entirely by Portnow, who has this to say about Simlish. To my knowledge, Simlish is the only language ever invented for the sole purpose of being enjoyed. Freed from the normal constraints of language, Simlish functions viscerally. An emotive language, it assumes an intimate relationship between its phonology and its vocabulary. The meaning of the sounds is supposed to be the meaning of the words. And that's really all Simlish is. It's fun. Maybe you'll be able to figure out a couple of words like sulsul or nibs, but the heart of Simlish is about being nonsensical. It was born from the improv of a couple of actors who wanted to make their performances sound right, and that legacy carries over for all of the new actors working on the latest games. Audio directors such as Claire Curtin have said that it can take upwards of 30 takes before a Simlish-speaking actor is able to nail whatever expression their sim is going for. And every single one of those takes is going to be different from the last. Trying to create a Simlish dictionary would be pretty much impossible, because that's not the point. Simlish isn't a language designed to be translated. It's a language designed to be enjoyed. Before you started watching this, you probably didn't need me to tell you that Eco and The Sims are two wildly differing games. One of them is an art house title designed to answer the question of whether or not you can form a bond with a person without sharing their language. The other is a game where the Grim Reaper kills you in front of your entire family and then eats an entire lasagna out of your fridge. Both of these titles are so contrasting in their messages and their themes, but they're unified in one single aspect: their use of imaginary languages. Eco uses its languages to further develop on the concepts found within its story, while The Sims uses its language to cover up the lack of story. These approaches are neither inherently good nor inherently bad. It all comes down to execution, and both of these games are masterclasses in their respective attitudes towards the use of fictional language. While it's almost impossible for a person to tell what's literally being said by the characters in either game, it's the way that these languages are spoken that carry all of the narrative emotions and pacing. And that's the root of all of this. None of what makes Eco or The Sims feel so special would be possible without the help of the voice actors, because they're the key to making these worlds come to life through their languages. They're two very different experiences, but they're both titles that have universal appeal. The stories and themes that you can find in these games can mean something to everybody, regardless of who they are or where they come from. Ultimately, this is just one solution to an issue that exists everywhere today. As it continues to get easier and easier to connect with people all over the globe, the world is becoming more of an open space than ever before. People who would have never been able to speak to someone outside of their own town 100 years ago can now speak to people in 40 different countries at the same time today. While it's easier to meet people than it used to be, that doesn't mean that we're all able to communicate with them. With so many different cultures and languages all across the world, it's impossible for one person to ever know them all. No matter what we do, we'll always be constrained in some way by the amount of languages that we can't know. Creating these fictional languages gives everyone an avenue to connect with characters in a story that they might not be able to otherwise. It falls to developers and writers and voice actors to appeal to more people in a way that could only ever strengthen the stories being told. Making your very own language isn't a perfect solution. It won't always be applicable, and doing a poor job might cause even more problems than just doing it in your native language. But if you've got the right people for the job and the will to see it through, well, that's just one more step towards breaking the language barrier. Hey, thanks for watching all the way to the end. After 3 months in development, I hope it was worth the wait. Hopefully future installments won't have this big of a production gap between them. I have taken a lot of steps to ensure that the editing process is as expedited and as fast as possible. So hopefully the next episode I am already writing as you're listening to this, and I don't anticipate it'll be anywhere near as long before that one comes out. But all the same, I hope you've enjoyed what you've seen up to this point, and if you'd like to actually help me move the production schedule along a bit more for these longer form episodes, why not consider donating to me on Patreon? I recently launched a Patreon. You can find the link to that in the video right now or in the description below. And, you know, if you've got some spare cash lying around, you've got some time, some inclination, maybe consider throwing a little bit my way. It really helps to keep the show in production, allows me to focus on it a bit more heavily than everything else. And ultimately, it's just a nice little incentive to keep the creative juices flowing. But all the same, these videos will always remain free and accessible to everyone, so please don't feel pressured to donate. Please just donate only if you are willing and able. Thank you all to everyone who has watched my videos, and a special thanks to my early patrons who are getting in on this before I've even announced it in the series itself. And yeah, hopefully I'll see you soon with a spicy little, potentially controversial video. And hopefully, I'll see you soon.